So I was very pleased to see how well everybody did on the midterm and the first written assignment. So here are the averages, which I hope you'll agree are spectacularly high. This is fantastic from my point of view because it's not just that one person thought that you did an excellent job on all of these things. We had 2 separate markers and a multiple choice section that was objectively marked that all got about the same average. So I would say that's intersubjective evidence that you as a class are doing spectacular work. So I'll go through the exact details in a second, but just enjoy this for one moment, how really well you've done. And I mean, I'm not surprised. U of T classes, in my experience, always come to work. Always come with the, like, if you give a task to a U of T class, they will work at it feverishly and to the best of their ability every single time. So I'm not surprised. I am slightly worried because these averages cannot go any higher than this. I will start to get in trouble, and the looming threat of a curve being opposed starts to become real. I've never heard of that happening at the institute where this course is based, but I think that's partly because instructors are rigorous and careful not to let the average get too high. If the end average of this class is like 85%, then we start to get into danger of having a curve imposed by the administration. However, that's probably not going to happen. These are hopefully the highest marks that we'll get of the semester, and that the more challenging final essay and exam will sort of bring this down a little bit. So maybe don't bank on these being like representative of your final marks. However, I am extremely pleased with how well everybody did on these first 2 things. Okay, so here's the distribution of the midterm out of 34, the total midterm. It's sort of a bell curve, but 1/2 of it is chopped off by the maximum possible number of points that you can score, so that's nice to see. Here's the short answer and definition combined. This is number of students against or sort of the score against number of students, of course. So there's that. And here's the just multiple choice. Again, it's greatly heartening to me that all of these measures came out with about the same. So here's the first written assignment. You'll notice a slight difference in that curve, the cutoff that nobody got over 25. This is partly a function of the way things are marked in the humanities. So if you check what the marks mean, so I take it from the sciences perspective, if you get 80%, that means you got 20% of it just wrong. Like there's a right and wrong answer, and if you got 80%, that means there's 20% of the issue that you got wrong. That's not the way we assign marks in these ill-defined problems that we've been offering you. So this written assignment at least is an ill-defined problem, and that means there's a different marking scale. If you got better than 80% on any given question, that means that the marker deemed your work to be excellent. That is, you demonstrated an excellent grasp of the material, excellent writing ability, excellent sort of ability to synthesize and analyze the concepts. That is, you've fully achieved the standards that we expect of you at U of T. If you got 90%, that means that you've done so spectacularly that the marker doubted that they could have done as well themselves, kind of thing. Okay, so that's what these marks mean. That if you got 24 out of 28, that means that the marker deemed your work to be really, really excellent. There was no problems with it specifically. It did not absolutely blow their mind with its insight and originality, but that's unlikely that anybody was going to do that on a short written assignment where your job is just to say what was in the course. No doubt this explanation will fail to satisfy some of you, and it will remain, you'll have the experience that this is unfair nonetheless. I don't really know how to help you with that beyond what I said already. So yeah, so there's that. Okay? I don't have the short answers to return to you right now. We'll have them on Wednesday. I do have the multiple choice sheets, which you can pick up at the end of class, if that's okay. Okay? And if you want an explanation of your short written assignment marks, I'll put you in touch with the TA who marked them. Okay? Okay. Again, really excellent work. I'm extremely pleased and also slightly nervous. at how well you all did. So let's talk about the final essay. The final essay topics are up. Here are them. Here they are. Pardon me. So choose one of these and write your essay on it. So choose a case study where it appears that the scientific process is being influenced by contextual values. Describe the case and how science and values are interacting. Assess the degree to which the scientific process maintains its integrity in the sense of, not in the sense of Longino's integrity thesis, but in the sense of like, is it still a good process in the face of this interaction? So this is just pick a case study and relate it through, look at it through the lens of the concepts that we've developed in this course. And it is very important for you that you use the concepts developed in this course, the frameworks that we've been trying to develop, because that's the evidence that the markers are going to use that you learned something while you were here. If you give us an essay that says climate change is bad, they will not have any evidence that you were attending this class, thinking about its content, and able to apply it to a case study. Okay, so sometimes when we offer very general essay questions like this, students come back with a paper that they just kind of obviously wrote for a different class. And if you do that, you will not get a good mark. You'll probably pass. It's hard to fail an essay project like this. Like getting below 50% is very rare. However, to get a good mark, to get into the A or A+ range, we're going to look for application of the concepts from this class to the specific case, and furthermore, that you have some kind of argument about. So this last clause here, so assess the degree to which the scientific process maintains its integrity in the face of this, is sort of like you making an argument about how we should think about this case study that you've identified. Okay? If you're worried about your case study, if you're not sure if it fits, please feel free to email me and we can chat about it. Okay? So the second one, provide an argument for or against Longino's integrity thesis. Explain your positions with arguments and examples from scientific practice. The second one is actually very similar to the first one, but with a more philosophical bent. So the first one is sort of a historical take where you say, like, let's start from a case study, one case study, develop it in detail, and then apply some philosophy to it. The second one is more like, let's do philosophy of science. So let's ask ourselves about the abstract question of how science and values interact, and then you can use sort of much less well-developed case studies to illustrate your point. You should still use at least some examples. You can draw them from the readings or from the lecture or from your own experience, that's fine. So this is just sort of a more, start from the abstract question rather than from a concrete case. Okay? And third, possible topic, provide an argument for or against the thesis that science can inform our values, which is of course the topic of the whole second half of the course. We're about to start talking about this question, to what extent can science tell us what is important? Okay. Any questions about the topics themselves? Just one sec. Okay, if you do think of a question, please email me. Yeah? Yeah. So yes, so right. So I use present continuous. Sorry, can you?
Yeah, like you said that science and us are interacting.
Oh, I see. Sorry, that could be present or it could be past.
Okay.
So if you want to choose a historical case study that everybody's sort of, well, we're looking back on rather than in the middle of, that's totally fine. So don't take that to be that it has to be an ongoing issue. Historical case studies are great here. They're kind of easier because there's more, the longer in the past it is, the more distance we have from it, the more we can kind of step outside the framework that they were in at the time and assess it from the long view. So yeah, historical case studies would be just fine there. Present case studies are also just fine. So if it's a debate that's ongoing, if it's a currently raging debate, that's probably going to be easier to find nice materials on, but either are fine. Any further questions? I think I'll probably talk again about this as we get closer to the due date. So this is just sort of the first pass at getting you ready for writing this assignment. Okay? Okay. So the rough structure is this: 1,500 to 2,500 words, not including bibliography. So that's just the body of the text. There should be a bibliography. That is, you should include some references. I do not have any specific number of references in mind. It could be 1, it could be 100, or anywhere in between. I would be shocked if you went over 100. Don't work that hard on this. It should contain journal articles and or books, or what I've called here highly reputable websites. We're currently in the middle of a transition of credibility. It used to be, when I started my degree, the only sources that were credible were journal articles and books because they were peer-reviewed, they'd made it through a certain academic credibility process. I don't think it's any reasonable at this time to say that only journal articles and books are credible. There are credible websites. So if you've gone to a news organization or the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, there are a handful of credible websites. Blogs don't count. If I could climb on the internet right now and put my opinion there, like medium.com, WordPress, random blogs do not count as credible sources for our purposes. However, if you do not need a credible source, that is if something's common knowledge or not under dispute or is not the thing that you are trying to show, then you don't need a citation. If you want to just say it was big in the newspapers the last 10 years that CRISPR has been this important gene editing technology, you don't have to cite that because nobody's arguing about it, nobody's disputing it, it's relatively common knowledge. Okay? So for controversial claims or claims that you're going to use as a basis of your argument, you need a citation, and it should be, your go-to should be books and journal articles. Credible websites, and I leave it to you and the TAs to decide what is a credible website. So be very careful about this. There is no guarantee that they're going to agree with you that the website you're citing is credible. Okay? I don't know how to do better than that because I don't want to tell you that the web is off limits. I kind of think Wikipedia is a reasonably credible website in this context. Is a reasonably credible website, but only reasonably. You don't want to base your argument around something that's on the Wikipedia page. You can use it for a common fact that's maybe not well known but isn't under dispute. But if it's something like the definition of the good life, don't cite Wikipedia. Sorry, I can't do any better for you than that. I think you're all sort of aware of the problem of credibility on the internet, so I leave that to your judgment. Any citation style is fine. But we must be able to find the exact quote you're using. So page numbers are required, assuming that it has page numbers. So if there is a page number, you must include it. And the whole point of a citation is for us to be able to look it up. And I don't know about these TAs, when I'm marking things, I do occasionally look something up. If a claim sounds odd or not quite right, I will look it up to see if the thing said what you said it did. And sometimes it doesn't. And that's very bad for you. So what we need is to be able to check that your source says what you say it does. So if you just say the name of a book, that's not an easy way for us to check. So include page numbers. Yeah? Okay. Now in the content, we would like you to have a thesis, a main claim that everything else in the paper is designed to defend. Right? So you're presenting an argument for something that you want us to think as well. It sounds awkward. I do not recommend you write this way any other time in your life, but include a sentence of the form, in this essay, I will argue, and then you say your thesis. That gives us an extremely explicit thing that says, here's my thesis. Okay? That makes it easy for them to identify your thesis, and that should be in the first paragraph, because everything after that is read in light of your thesis. So they're filtering for relevance. Are you saying things that are relevant to your thesis? So we need that right up at the top, explicitly say, here's my thesis, and then they'll be able to read everything else after that as, is this contributing, is this moving the argument towards believing the thesis or isn't it? Okay? And every sentence in your paper should be directed towards either explaining or arguing for your thesis. Every single sentence. Everything else is a waste. Everything else is just fluff, as they call it. So one strategy is to write a 4,000-word essay and cut out all the fluff. It helps, actually. Or write, a 3-paragraph introduction and cut it down to 1 once you've decided exactly what it's about. Okay? In terms of style, this is the only piece of advice that I'll give you. Use paragraph breaks wisely. And I want to explicitly warn you against what they very likely taught you in high school, which is that essays are composed of 5 paragraphs. This is a bizarre and unwarranted use of paragraph breaks that I cannot believe that they teach people still. But because nobody writes like that. Nobody writes a 10-page thing with only 5 paragraphs. Paragraph breaks indicate a topic change. So within your paper, I would recommend you use subheadings. So the 5 paragraphs thing should actually be in your mind 5 subheadings or something like that. You don't actually have to use 5, but like an intro, description of your case. So if you're doing case study, you do an intro, description of case study, explanation of the philosophy background, and then your argument for your specific thesis about it or something like that, and then a conclusion. So that would be 5 subheadings, not 5 paragraphs. A paragraph is a collection of sentences that are all exactly on one topic. The first sentence is the topic sentence. It introduces the topic of the paragraph, and literally every sentence after that are about that topic and nothing else. And if you find yourself having 2 topics within a paragraph, you should put a paragraph break in there. So this is one of the ways that you offer somebody an easy to read piece of writing so that you have it chunked into reasonable chunks, like 2 or 3 paragraphs on a page, 1 topic per paragraph. The first sentence always gives the topic of the paragraph. So then you could skim a book like that. Or like if you write a book like that, you can skim it, right? You see the subheading, oh, I know what this basic chunk of text is about. You can look at the topic sentences and see the basic progression of the ideas. And then if you want, you can get into the paragraphs if you want more detail. So what you're doing is making writing that's easily skimmable, which is an important skill for all of you. Right? They're going to read your thing in detail, but you're writing it so it's skimmable. And I just want to give you one example of a really nice paragraph. So here's what a good paragraph looks like. The topic sentence, compared with other animals, says Dr. Kidd, some of whose young can stand up and move around within minutes of being born, human infants take a year to learn, even to walk, and need constant supervision for many years afterwards. So it's a big sentence, but that's the topic sentence. So everything in this paragraph is about how human kids take a long time to walk compared to a lot of other animals. So that helplessness, that is the helplessness just described in the topic sentence, is thought to be one consequence of intelligence, or at least of brain size. In order to keep their heads small enough to make live birth possible, human children must be born at an earlier stage of development than other animals. So now we're explaining why the topic sentence is true. But Dr. Piandosi and Dr. Kidd, both of whom studied child development, wondered if it might be a cause as well as a consequence of intelligence as well. So now we're considering what the kind of status of this topic sentence, the truth. So assume the topic sentence is true. Now we're wondering about whether it's a cause or consequence of something else. All right. So that's just, don't worry about the subject of the paragraph. Just look at how nice a paragraph this is. It introduces a topic, and then every single sentence is illuminating that topic in some way. And then once you're done talking about just that specific topic, you do a paragraph break and go on. Please don't feel that I'm talking down to you. As a group, paragraphs are really hard. Like, I know you've written paragraphs. I know you've read paragraphs. This might sound super easy, but I guarantee that most people cannot do this. Most people, it takes years and years of training to learn how to write good paragraphs and how to use paragraph breaks to write a topic sentence, to have everything related to the topic sentence, and have a paragraph break when you move on to a new topic. It takes years and years of practice. It really does. So this is harder than it sounds. Try to do this. Okay? This is the key to good writing on a sort of page-by-page basis. Okay. In terms of the blinding, we're going to do the essay blinded again, which means very seriously, do not write your name in the file or the file name. I would say 20% of you wrote your name either on the file or the file name. So I thought I was reasonably clear about you shouldn't do that, but so nothing bad happened, by the way, and I entered the marks myself, and I saw that a great many people who did put their name in the file or the file name did really well. So it's not correlated to your sort of general ability in the class. It is correlated to your ability to listen carefully to instructions and follow through on them, however. You should get both of those things. You should both have general competence with ideas and the capacity to carefully and pedantically follow instructions. So to that end, I'm going to put a 5% penalty on assignments that are not properly blinded. So if I see your name on the file name or in the file, you'll get a 5% deduction on your assignment. Since you're all here listening to me right now, this should worry none of you. None of you should be at all concerned about that because you're all going to successfully blind your papers, right? Yeah, good. Yeah?
Why would you ask our opinion on blind marking at the beginning of the course that penalized us for different?
Because 85% of you decided to go with blind marking. That was the decision of the class, and now I'm going to enforce the decision of the class. Okay? It wasn't blinded if you feel like it. We all decided, the vast majority of you decided to go with blinding. It doesn't work unless, so either I have to go through and change all of the file names and erase your name from it, or the blinding process doesn't work, right? Those are basically my options. So we decided, the vast majority of you decided to go with blinding. We're going to go with blinding, and I'm going to enforce it. Yeah? Okay. And the file name should start with your student number. So a whole bunch of people didn't do this either. A whole bunch of people gave me file names that started with HPS200. So just quickly, I mean, let me show you what that looks like from my perspective. So where are they? Sorry. So mostly what I got is a list of student numbers all in nice order, and I can enter the grades one by one because they're all in a nice order. And then I get, down at the bottom, I get a whole bunch of this stuff, which means I have to like hunt for your student number and do a bunch of like deductions. Sometimes deductions, if you didn't include your student number in the file, I had to like reverse engineer who it was that submitted it. So that's why I ask you to do your file name should start with your student number. Okay? Clear? Okay, good. I imagine I'll still get 5% of people who don't blind their thing because they're either not listening or they don't care, but that's fine. You will all successfully blind your papers, right? To avoid the 5% penalty. Good. All right. So that's it for prep work, and now we're ready to get into the content, unless there's any other questions about the midterm, the first assignment, or the final written assignment. Yeah. All right. So we're now getting into the second half of the course, which is asking about the reverse of the first half. The first half was, can values influence science? And now we're on to the question of, can science tell us what to value? So here's this painting by Paul Gauguin from 1878. In the corner, top left-hand corner, he wrote, the first three questions were Paul's. He says, where do we come from? What are we? Where are we going? And I would add to that a fourth essential question from Tolstoy, which is, how shall we live? I take it that these are the most fundamental questions that you can ask about your own existence. These are the questions which you use to orient yourself in the world of people, in the world of your own goals, in the world of your life projects. Like everything that you are about should be oriented around your answers to these questions. Not everybody has answers to these questions that they feel confident about. You should feel slightly jealous of religious people because they do have answers to these questions. So where do we come from? God created us. What are we? God's children. Where are we going? Heaven or hell? How should we live? However God said we should. So for a religious person or a person that's, I gave you the sort of the Christian version of that, which is what I'm most familiar with, they have answers to these questions, clear, crisp answers. I was raised without religion. Neither of my parents were religious. They did not give me any kind of religious upbringing. So for me, those answers aren't really satisfying. And I've spent most of my life struggling to come up with answers that could be satisfying to myself within a kind of secular scientific framework. I can tell you that your life is profoundly different if you have answers to these questions, and if those answers are well integrated with each other. The difference is unmistakable. I go back and forth. Sometimes I feel like I have answers to all four of them. They're well integrated, and they lift me up like a surfer on a wave. And about once a year I get depressed, and my answers either are unsatisfying or fail to cohere with each other, and it's like the wave has gone away. Your life is just profoundly different if you have answers, and they're answers that are well integrated with each other to these four questions. So the question that I'd like to explore for the second half of this course is to what extent science can provide us with answers to the four of them. I take it that science has got a fairly good shot at, or the scientists in general believe that they have at least answers to the first two. Right? So where do we come from? The contemporary scientific consensus is that we're evolved beings. We came about through a process of evolution, mostly by natural selection. What are we? Well, we're living things. We're organisms. And furthermore, we're vertebrates, we're mammals, we're primates, we're Homo sapiens. So that's the kind of scientific answer to what are we? Well, we're closely related to chimpanzees and other simians. So if you want to know what kind of thing you are, you can look at our kind of close evolutionary family and get at least some clues. The question is, the very serious question, and the question to which I will not probably satisfy you that we've got an answer to, are where are we going and how should we live? And the standard view on this, I would say, is given by Tolstoy, who said this. He said, "Science is meaningless because it gives no answer to our question. The only question important for us, what shall we do and how shall we live?" I would take it that this is if you ask most people about the relationship between science and values, this is what they tell you. And I think a lot of very smart people think this as well. So I don't want to present this to you as a kind of straw man view that nobody serious thinks. Lots of very serious smart people think this. I want to insist that this is a question that we're all facing, practically all of the time. The great philosophical innovation of the 20th century, existentialism, suggested that, oh, well, we create our own meaning in life. That's the whole thing for them. So where are we going is a question that nature doesn't answer. It's a question that we answer for ourselves. And that's fine. That's all well and good. But it still leaves you with this question, doesn't it? The question is, what purpose should you set over yourself? What should you aim at? And I would love it if science could give us a serious answer to this question. I think it can give us some constraints on this question. So that's basically what I'll be arguing. But constraints are not the same as an answer. So you can sort of say what's ruled out, but maybe you can't say what's ruled in. And it's certainly not the case that the constraints are provided straightforwardly in the same way that the weight of an electron is provided straightforwardly by science. I mean, giving the weight of an electron is a long project that we're still engaged in, and it's sort of imprecise, and we could always be wrong. But at the same time, science does seem to be converging on one and only one answer to that question. Whereas this one, it's much less clear that we're homing in on something. And the standard philosophical reason given for why science cannot tell us the answer to Tolstoy's question is what's called Hume's law. So David Hume defended this idea that, to put it in slogan form, you can't derive an ought from an is. Right? So any descriptive statement about the world can only tell you how things are. You cannot go straight from that to how things ought to be. And of course, natural sciences tell us how the world is, not how it ought to be. This is the standard view. And this applies to any normative language like should, good, bad, all that stuff. Okay. So people disagree on exactly what Hume was saying, so I'll get a little bit pedantic here. He could be saying that there are simply no moral facts, that morality is just a bunch of emotions. This is a view held by lots of philosophers. Actually, this was the standard view in English-speaking philosophy in the 20th century. Just moral anti-realism. Like, there are no natural moral facts. For any moral question, there's no fact of the matter imposed by nature. Or he could be saying that you need moral facts in addition to descriptive facts to derive moral conclusions. So you can't just start with a descriptive fact and go straight to a moral fact. You need some kind of moral principle attached to it in order to get to your moral fact. That one strikes me as a more plausible version of this. So, for example, that your hands are dirty does not immediately entail that you should wash your hands. You could probably imagine scenarios in which it's better not to wash your hands, or maybe you just don't care about your hands being dirty. Maybe that's not a thing that you value, right? So in addition to the fact of the matter, you need some normative principle or normative kind of fact from which, so your hands are dirty plus it's good to be clean does seem to entail you should wash your hands, right? So this is the weaker version of Hume's law, not that moral facts are just null and void, not that moral facts simply are not facts, but that it's in isolation, a descriptive fact never entails a moral fact. Now, of course, to believe that there are these moral principles that you can associate with descriptive facts is to believe that you can somehow justify the moral principles. So you have to believe that there are sort of ethical facts floating independently of the descriptive facts, which, again, lots of people have been skeptical about that, but lots of people have believed it as well. So this is the debate. Similarly, astronomy can teach us new facts about the universe, therefore we should fund astronomy research. I hope that strikes you as a perfectly good inference, sort of prima facie, but because you've got some implicit and knowledge is a good thing, right? That's the moral principle that usually goes unarticulated, but that does this hidden job of actually connecting the descriptive fact with the moral fact. Okay? So, again, the standard view is science cannot tell us what's important because science can only tell us the descriptive stuff. The text that's all white there is the descriptive part, and cannot yield the red moral principle that's what you need to derive a moral conclusion or a normative conclusion. Yeah? That part strikes me as plausible, right? So that you can't just say, well, here's a fact, and that tells us what to do. Another version of this, or a related principle that you should have in mind, is the naturalistic fallacy. So in general, it's an error from something being natural to being good. So the classic example is, of course, cyanide is a perfectly natural product. It's produced in a bunch of plants, but maybe it's good in some contexts, but it's certainly not just a good thing overall because it's natural. So this is the naturalistic fallacy. It's kind of a more specific version of Hume's law. Hume's law says facts can't tell you whether something's good or bad. Naturalistic fallacy says facts can't. Just the fact that something is a product of nature does not entail that it's a good thing. Right. Okay. So what you need in order to justify a normative conclusion according to this line of reasoning is one of these ethical theories, of course. Right? So you need some account from, maybe poisoning your roommate will make the most happiness for the most people, and that's why it's good to give them cyanide. Maybe you have a duty to put down your sick cat, and that's why it's good to give it cyanide, so on and so forth, right? Socrates drank hemlock and killed himself because he thought it was the virtuous thing to do in that context. And ethics of care, maybe, I don't know, you can imagine, you can fill in for yourself how cyanide could be a good thing, or drinking cyanide could be a good thing, given these different accounts of what's good and what's bad. Right? So what you need in order to make a normative, to arrive at a normative conclusion, is some kind of normative principle associated with your descriptive facts. So science can give you the descriptive facts, everybody agrees on that. The question is, are there normative principles as well that can be used together with the description to entail normative conclusions? And I remind you that not everybody agrees that there are such normative principles. Some people are moral anti-realists, which means that they don't believe that any moral principle is better than any other, that there are no facts of the matter about what's right and wrong. Today, the readings for today are one chapter of Sam Harris's book, The Moral Landscape. I'd love for you to read it. You can also watch his TED Talks, which are from this. If you watch any of his TED Talks or talks from the same era, he's going over basically this material. So if you find the reading boring, he's a good writer, but you can also hear him talk about it. So he claims in this chapter that what grounds normative claims is the suffering or the well-being of conscious beings. This is his account of how science can tell us what's important, because suffering and well-being are facts about physical things. You are an organism in the world, and your suffering or your well-being must correspond to some physical facts about you. Therefore, in principle at least, science can tell us what brings about those states of flourishing or non-flourishing. I read him as systematically ambiguous between the ethics of happiness and the ethics of virtue. So he talks about well-being as though it corresponds to something like happiness, but he also uses phrases that are very characteristic of virtue ethics, like well-being or flourishing. Usually when philosophers talk about flourishing, they're virtue ethicists. So he's kind of somewhere, maybe he's in both of those categories. These are not exclusive categories. So perhaps Sam Harris is occupying both the ethics of happiness and the ethics of virtue, but overall what he's claiming is that well-being is a fact about physical things and therefore is in principle studyable by science. And he's careful to wind that back and not claim that in practice right now today we can in fact figure out what's right and what's wrong. So he's not making the claim that today science can tell us what's right and wrong. He's just saying in principle it should be, and that we should maybe gear ourselves up and begin the project in earnest of figuring out how to get there. So should we take a 10-minute break before we get into Harris's arguments? Nobody's furiously nodding at me. Okay, let's keep going for another 10 minutes and we'll get back to this. So you have to be more visibly, if you really want to break, you have to be more visibly into it. So Harris gives two arguments for why well-being should be a fact about conscious being. So it's a fact about living conscious beings. Two thought experiments, essentially. So he has us imagine the worst possible universe, the universe in which everyone suffers maximally. It's just hell, right? So imagine hell, where everybody's experiencing the maximum amount of suffering all the time. That, he says, is bad. And if you don't agree that that's bad, then we're not kind of speaking the same language. Right? If you don't agree that that's somehow bad, like the whole universe is just hell, there's no heaven, there's no earth, it's just everything is suffering all the time for some reason, that's got to be bad, right? And I don't know anybody who strongly disagrees with the idea that that would be bad. I think according to all of the accounts of ethics, that's just terrible. Okay. So this is to put a kind of bottom limit on, look, if you don't agree that that's bad, I don't know what you mean by the word bad. Yeah? Okay, so that's his first argument, to tie well-being into the well-being of conscious creatures to good and bad. Second argument was like this. Imagine a universe with no conscious beings, just rocks and dust. There are no agents, there's no living things. It's just empty planets swirling around slowly dying stars. Now, nothing in that universe seems to matter, right? There's nothing good or bad that could happen in it, really. It's inconceivable, at least to me, that there's any harms or benefits, that there's any good or bad. Like if an asteroid slams into an empty planet, who cares? If an asteroid slams into our planet, I would argue that that's bad, because we have a whole bunch of living things, a whole bunch of conscious beings, and we would all be most perturbed by that. But in an empty universe, there don't seem to be any normative facts in a universe completely empty of life and consciousness. Okay? So those are his two main arguments, presented in this chapter at least, for tying the states of conscious beings to normative facts, to try to ground normative facts in facts about either the flourishing or suffering of conscious living beings. Is that fairly clear how those two arguments are supposed to work? Like, the first one sets a limit. Like, if you have pure suffering, that's got to be bad. If you have nothing at all, that's got to be neutral. Like that's just, there's no normativity whatsoever. I notice he doesn't use the opposite of the first argument. So he doesn't have us imagine heaven where everybody's just in maximal bliss all the time, because I think that's harder to imagine. Just being in eternal suffering is really easy to imagine. It's disturbingly easy to imagine. I find heaven really hard to imagine. Like, what would keep me busy and happy for eternity? Do you grow there? Do you learn new things forever? I find it very mind-bending to imagine the state of maximal flourishing. Maximal suffering is fairly easy to imagine, and an empty universe is also fairly easy to imagine. So the combined weight of these two thought experiments are supposed to convince you that whatever good and bad mean, they've got to have something to do with the states of conscious beings. Okay. Therefore, moral considerations are about the well-being of conscious creatures. And since well-being is a state of the body, including the brain, it is physical, and anything physical can be studied by science. That's the inference. So in principle, we can study well-being. Now, that doesn't mean that there's just one thing that corresponds to well-being. He's very insistent on this. That's why he calls it a moral landscape. The moral landscape is supposed to be, imagine a plane of different ways of being in the universe. So every point on this landscape is a different way of being a conscious being and getting around in the world. And you can imagine the height of the point being whether you're flourishing or suffering. So there are various peaks and there are various valleys on the moral landscape. So maybe there's an infinite number of different ways for you to be incredibly high up on the flourishing scale. So there might be as many ways as you can imagine to live a good life. And there could be as many ways as you can imagine to live a terrible life full of suffering. So he's not arguing that science will tell us the one and only way to live. What he's arguing is science can inform us about the structure of this landscape. That is, it can tell us what counts or what we have to do in our lives to flourish, and what we have to do in our lives, what will cause us to suffer. In principle, at least. Okay. I guess I should make it clear that philosophers really don't like Sam Harris or his work at all. They don't take him very seriously. They find him to not engage with the debate, but I find that a lot of really smart people have engaged with his ideas and do take him seriously, so I think it's worth doing. So the fundamental question that I would put to Harris, so that's the rough outline of his view. Right? So there's consciousness, good and bad have to have something to do with the states of conscious creatures, and that science in principle can tell us what will bring a conscious creature to the good or to the bad. But this leaves a really important open question. And I'd like you to think a little bit about the relationship between this question and the kinds of things that science is good at answering. So the question is, what is well-being in the first place? What is it to live a good life? And what experiment would you run to figure that out? Right? So science is really, really good at, given a question, pursuing the answer to it. Science is by far the best strategy that we've ever come up with for taking a well-defined question and working out answers to it. But if the question is, what is a good life? What is well-being? It's not so clear to me. So that's a question about the question itself. So what question are you going to pose to science? I've got up here Aristotle and the Buddha. And these two guys both talked a lot about, they're both virtue ethics people. They both talked a lot about ethics as trying to achieve the good life. But they had quite different views of what the good life looks like. So for Aristotle, the good life is living in a busy city, doing philosophy, talking to lots of people, having parties, drinking the right amount, not too much, not too little, having a really social life. So Aristotle said man is a social animal, or man is a political animal. Women as well, of course. The Buddha recommend, at least in the Pali Canon, that you leave the city, go find a nice tree, and sit under it until you're free of all of your worldly desires. Essentially, you should beg as little as you need to live without distraction from hunger. You should talk as little as possible, other than to ask questions about your moral training. You should be unbound from the world. And that's what it is to live a good life. And those two things should strike you as radically, radically different pictures of what flourishing looks like. So which is it? Which do you test for? Like you can run an experiment about, so if your experiment is what causal inputs enhance a person's ability to detach from their worldly desires, that's an experiment you can run. Right? You could operationalize those concepts in reasonably formal ways, and you could run a series of experiments or a whole research program on what allows you to not want too much food, to not miss your family, to not, get greedy. You could also run an experiment on, and they do, on what helps people enhance their social relationships, on what helps people engage more effectively in their community, on what helps people moderate their drinking to the level they find acceptable. Those are a whole separate set of research questions that you could be asking. And I hope that what we showed you in the first half of the course was science is really, really good at answering a question once posed. But there's this pre-scientific problem of coming up with the question itself. And this is a problem about the question itself, which I'm afraid Harris doesn't give us much in the way of dealing with this. Yeah?
Is Sam Harris a philosopher?
So Sam Harris does not hold any degrees in philosophy as far as I know. He holds a degree in neuroscience. He does, so I hesitate to say that makes him not a philosopher. He's certainly trying to do that thing that that Sellers said was the aim of philosophy, which is to see how things in general hang together in the most general sense. He is definitely not popular in the academic philosophy community. So if acceptance by a community is what you're counting as being a philosopher, then he's kind of not. If trying to understand the general structure of reality is what you count as a philosopher, then I think he is. So it depends what you mean by what is a philosopher.
But we're studying his philosophy right now, right?
Yes, we're studying his claims, yes.
And if philosophers don't agree with him, he seems really important.
So yes, it does. So I'm flagging this as a point of great disagreement. So the point of this class is not to convince you of any given position in these arguments. It's to give you the structure of the arguments, right? So here's one position. Sam Harris is really useful in this because he occupies a position that, frankly, not many professional philosophers defend. So very few professional philosophers are going to come to the table and say, yes, science can tell us what's important, the end. So I would like to have somebody representing that view to you so that, I mean, in each of these cases, I'm trying to give you, here is the majority opinion. I would say the majority opinion of philosophy is Tolstoy's view, which says, no, science can't tell us what's important. So I'm trying to give you that, but I don't think I need to elaborate that very much because it's the common view. So Sam Harris represents the alternative to that, and I did have to go outside the mainstream of philosophy to find somebody who's defending it. So that's why I gave you Sam Harris, and I definitely don't mean to give you this as the, here's what philosophers all think. So that, does that satisfy your wonder? So it is important, it is crucially important that Sam Harris is outside of the mainstream of philosophy. The mainstream philosophers, they worry much more about his methodology than his conclusions, I would say, because he doesn't engage with the history of philosophy in any kind of serious way. So he doesn't talk about meta-ethics really much at all. He doesn't do the standard sort of philosophical moves. But on the other hand, I worry a lot about the discipline of academic philosophy and whether it's got the right methodology itself. So maybe bringing in voices from outside of the mainstream I think it's helpful to keep us on our toes, to keep us thinking fresh. Like, if you have to have made it through the gauntlet of getting an academic job in philosophy, maybe you're not getting all the viewpoints that you should be considering, because it does get fairly narrow and technical. Academic philosophy has a well-earned reputation for narrowness and technicalness that maybe stifles our ability to see the big picture. And so the attempt here is to give you a voice from outside of the mainstream, to give you a more well-rounded picture of the debate as it exists. So I'll move on to talking about, after Sam Harris, I'll talk a little bit about Philippa Foot, who is within the mainstream of academic philosophy and represents what I hope is a sort of more subtle and refined version of the same basic thought. Okay, but that's a good point. Like, it is a good point that we should keep in mind sort of Sam Harris's position in this debate, what his goals are, and what his sort of, where he is in the credibility process for philosophy. He's not doing great in the credibility process in philosophy, so just so you know. And these are pretty much the reasons. So we were talking about this question that Harris, I think, doesn't really give us a really satisfying answer to, which is, what is well-being? And I'm going to give you an unfair caricature of his view, but like, here are at least a couple of questions that you might ask about well-being. How do you measure well-being? So you recall, this is the Mercator projection. This is I can't remember the name of this projection, but these are perfectly accurate maps. Both of these are perfectly accurate maps of the surface of the Earth. They just have different ways of measuring that surface. Right? They're different ways of reducing the information to a projectable form, to take a 3D fact and turn it into a 2D representation, and they produce radically different results. So precisely this question of what frame you're bringing to bear on the issue is the one that maybe we need more data about. You need some way of deciding how you measure well-being. And did I miss it? Yeah. So Harris's answer, and here's the caricature. I'm being unfair to him, but just the short version is, it's obvious in some cases. He says, it's obvious to me that some things are more detrimental to well-being than others. So, you can just tell. Is the only answer that I've been able to extract. I would love to be wrong about this, that he has a more robust argument that I missed, but it seems to me that his answer to the question of what do we test, so once you have something to test, then science can get its teeth into it, right? So once you know what the right question to ask is, science gives us a really excellent procedure for trying to come up with answers to that question. But if the question is, what question do we ask? This seems to me more or less Harris's answer, which is that it's obvious. It's obvious that letting children drink water contaminated with lead is bad, and that giving them fresh, clean water is good. To me, that's totally obvious. But The other thing that I would like for you to have brought out of the first half of this class is the relationship between truth and obviousness, which is that lots of things are obvious, but not true. Right? Given a framework, given a way of seeing the world, certain things will just be totally obvious to you. So given the Newtonian framework, it was just totally obvious that space-time is Euclidean. There's no curves, there's no weird deformations of space-time. That was totally obvious to everybody. And it's wrong. And whatever discipline you're in, I want you to be very aware of this, because the more training you have in a discipline, the more its assumptions become obvious to you. Right? You see through them transparently. Historians see the world as a series of very specific local things, and they do not like seeing the big picture. Philosophers see the world from the big picture, and they don't care that much about the details. And the assessments of relevance there become just totally obvious to both groups. So in some sense, obviousness is the enemy of reason in this case. It's obvious to Sam Harris that a society that is open to homosexuality is better for everybody involved. It's completely obvious to him, as it's obvious to me. It's equally obvious to people who are running countries where homosexuality is punished with the death penalty that that's the best thing. It's exactly as obvious to them as my position is to me. So saying that it's just obvious seems to be a non-starter in this conversation. Right? That you can't just say, well, you can just tell when something's good or when something's bad. And using this as your answer seems to me to reflect a pretty serious lack of historical perspective. That there's been a variety of things that were totally obvious as the good life. So here's a question. So during the break, I got this really nice question about, like, well, doesn't Harris define well-being as happiness? We use happiness as our thing to measure. But then the question is, what does happiness mean? What does it mean to be happy? Whatever you do, you're going to try to be happy, right? So how about this? This is Robert Nozick's experience machine. This is a thought experiment that asks us to consider what we really want in life. So imagine you get plugged into this machine, and it gives you just an endless series of pleasurable experiences. Whatever it is you like to do with your day, it'll do that all day long. But you can never leave. Would you be plugged in? I think most people say no. I think if you ask them, the majority of people, they go, no, I wouldn't. I would sacrifice a life of endless pleasure to continue the life I have now, which sometimes, frankly, sucks, often unpleasant, difficult in a variety of ways, uncertain, and even more. But it's real, and therefore I'm happier living my real life than a life of unending simulated pleasure. But happier in what sense? Now we've divorced, so think what we've done to the word happiness here. We've divorced it from just simple pleasure, right? If you think that well-being can be reduced to simple pleasure, and you think the goal of life is to maximize your well-being, then you should be willing to be plugged into the pleasure machine, the sense machine. What is it called? Yeah. But most people, I think, don't. So if it's something more than pure happiness, if it's more than simple pleasure, what is it? What are the goals that were so important that you would give up a life of endless pleasure for? And I would like to just offer you this historical contrast between two radically different pictures of what society and the good life should be. This one on the left is from the Tao Te Ching. He says, both of these writers are speaking to the sort of the people governing their societies. This is advice for leaders on how to generate a society with maximal well-being. Lao Tzu says, the governance of the sage empties the people's hearts, fills their bellies, weakens their ambitions, and strengthens their bones. So the way to generate maximum well-being in your society is to have people well-fed, safe, and not that ambitious. Stability, peace, quiet. That's what a good life looks like. This is Bacon from the Novum Organum, presenting a radically different view of what life ought to be like. Arts and sciences should be like mines, where the noise of new works and further advances is heard on every side. This is what a good life, this is what you should organize your society if you want the people in it to flourish. You should be making constant advances, constant developments. Both in the arts and the sciences should be filled with novelty. And those two cannot be more different as far as I can tell. Like, these are radically different views of what well-being, what a society should be like to foster the well-being of the people who live in it. And which of those is right? So if we're not just looking at pleasure, so pleasure is fairly straightforward to measure, I would argue. Like, you could probably correlate it with certain neurotransmitters being released in certain neurons, kind of thing. But supposing that pleasure doesn't exactly equal happiness, doesn't exactly equal well-being, now you have to ask, what more in life is it that we're after? And here are two quite different views. And I don't know how you decide between these in a quick and easy way. Yeah?
Why do we have to decide between them? Why can't we have a mix of both?
Well, I take it that these are mutually, so the question is, why can't we have both? I take it that these are mutually exclusive in terms of, because they're both not just advice for your life, they're advice for how a society should be structured. So if your society is such that people's hearts are empty, their bellies are full, and their bones are strong, in the sense that they're living a simple, stable, sustainable life, that's the opposite of constant advance, constant novelty, constant change. That this is a society, Bacon's society is like our society. Like, the media and the music today are not going to be the same as the media and music 10 years from now. Of that, I'm more sure than practically anything in my life. That we are living in a world of constant change and constant development. Maybe even not even to the good, but we're on this ride, we're on this slide, and we're going faster and faster. Yeah?
But can't we have constant change where people pursue their ambitions and their ideas, but still have their belly full and still feel sick?
You can have your belly full, for sure. But you can't have what practically all of our ancestors had. Practically all of our ancestors had a world where the world that their parents left them resembled in almost every way the world they inhabited, and the world that their children would inhabit resembled in almost every way the world that they inhabited. And I think that's part of the spirit, that's at least part of the spirit of what Laos is suggesting. Practically all of our ancestors lived in worlds that were like that, where your parents' world was almost indistinguishable from your world was almost indistinguishable from your kids' world, or your nieces and nephews' worlds. And that's what Laos is recommending as what makes people really happy, the stability of the world. So we could, if you want to sort of distill the difference here, Laos is recommending a stable society, a society at equilibrium. And Bacon is recommending a society far from equilibrium, a society that's undergoing constant internal change. So I don't think you can have both steady state and far from equilibrium. Yeah?
You can, because you can have a stable life, but still pursue what you want, still change. Because if we just look at Laos, wouldn't that be the naturalistic fallacy? The way things were are good because that's how it was.
I don't think that.
Shouldn't we pursue constant change but still be able to feel safe?
I think what you're recommending here is Bacon, but with like a social safety net or something like that. Like Bacon's world of constant change, but everybody is free from violence, confident they're going to have 3 meals today and tomorrow, and that their world is full of at least some opportunity, something like that. So that sounds like a nice version of Bacon. It does not sound to me like the world that Lao Tzu recommends. Lao Tzu is recommending a world where basically everything just stays the same. So the music stays the same, the art stays the same, sciences aren't advancing, and all of that stuff produces just profound change. And it's the difference between a society at rest and a society in change. And I don't think you can have both. You can have safety in a society of change. I think that's what Canada's like. Canada is such that practically everybody in it is confident that they're going to be able to eat a meal tomorrow. Not everybody, like 90% of us. And most of us are safe from physical violence most of the time. But yeah.
Corey, I think what you mean to say is the mutually exclusive parts is ambitions and arts. Because in one instance you have
Good. That's a nice way of bringing out the difference. Yeah. So this is people are supposed to be, in Laozi's vision of the good life, people are supposed to be basically satisfied with where they're at. You're not trying to build a better world for your children. You're trying to reproduce the world that you find yourself in because it's reasonably pleasant. Whereas in Bacon's world, you are trying to leave a different world for the people that came after you. And this is, I mean, I take it that Bacon's vision is like the one that practically everybody here inhabits, right? This is the world that we're living in where change is the only thing that I feel confident that's going to be constant for the rest of my life. I'm very confident that the world that I leave will not resemble in a variety of ways the world that I came into. And I don't know. I don't know of a good argument for why one is just better than the other, or what experiment you would run to decide that this vision of the good life is better than that vision. But I agree with the idea that maybe the truth lies somewhere in between and that we can take the best of both, something like that. But that strikes me as a third synthetic vision rather than one or the other of these pure visions. Okay, good. So that was the question. So that was one of my major critiques of Harris. So what counts as well-being, and how do you even decide? I guess the answer that I would suggest is you do a bunch of philosophy. So philosophy and art and religion are the traditional ways of trying to determine answers to those questions, or to produce suggestions on answers to those questions. And they don't really fall within the scientific method because the scientific method starts with a question. You know, you start the scientific process with a well-defined question, and then you can look for answers. But those are all questions about what should the question be. Okay. Here's another line of questioning. So Sam Harris makes this claim that he's got a background in neuroscience. Remember what I just said about, you know, the suppositions of your field becoming just obvious facts to you. So when you spend enough time in neuroscience, everything starts looking like a question about neuroscience. When you spend enough time in philosophy, everything starts looking like a philosophical problem, as my friends have often complained to me. So Harris makes this claim that well-being is something that happens in brains. So neuroscience is where we should focus for answers to the well-being questions. You should look at the brains of people who are flourishing and the brains of people who are suffering and figure out what causal factors put people in one category or the other. And his argument goes something like this. So normativity must have some connection to the experiences of conscious creatures. That's the conclusion of those first two arguments that I presented to you, if you recall. So the hell universe and the empty universe both were meant to show that this first thing is true. Second premise, consciousness happens in the brain. That's where consciousness mainly resides, although that's kind of being debated, whether our conscious experience is exclusively a brain phenomenon or if it's also involves the rest of our body. Like, there's quite a few neurons in your stomach. There's neurotransmitters all over your body. Okay, but for the purpose of this conversation, consciousness happens in the brain. Brains are natural objects. Therefore, neuroscience can, in principle, determine what is good and important. So neuroscience is the science to consider. Now, I don't like this argument. I don't think it follows. It's not a valid argument in my opinion. So here are two parallel arguments that I think show the weakness in this line of reasoning. So, normativity must have some connection to the experience of conscious creatures. Consciousness happens in the brain. Brains are made of atoms. Therefore, atomic physics can, in principle, determine what's important. How do you feel about that argument? Same, structurally the same, I would argue. But it comes to a conclusion where, like, you're studying very intensely the properties of carbon atoms, looking for well-being. And I would argue that that's probably not the right level of analysis. But it's the same argument. Here's another. Winning at chess means getting the pieces into a certain arrangement. Chess pieces are made of wood. Therefore, studying wood will teach you how to play chess. So what you should do to become a chess master is get a microscope and investigate the rook in intimate detail. And once you've mapped out all the little grains in the rook, that will tell you how to play chess properly. Because, of course, chess is just getting chess pieces arranged properly. Okay. I hope you don't think that that's the case. Because, of course, that's not the right way to learn chess. The right way to learn chess is to learn the abstract, high-level properties of chessboards. You study the arrangement of the pieces. It doesn't matter if they're made of wood or plastic or metal or whatever, right? The properties that you're interested in are overall structural properties, not the micro properties. And they're not the properties of the parts, they're properties of the whole board, or at least the arrangement of the pieces on the board. So what Harris does here, oh, he smeared out, I'm sorry. So assumes his face is not that wide in real life. Harris's argument assumes explanatory reductionism. The thesis is that the explanation is at the level of the parts. The best explanation is at the level of the parts rather than the whole. And this is something that philosophers have disputed, so the general thesis of reductionism. So this is Hilary Putnam again. So I mentioned Hilary Putnam once before, his argument against radical relativism. This is our argument against reductionism or extreme reductionism. Putnam's great for these short, pithy little arguments. So he says, we could explain why the square peg doesn't go through the round hole using quantum physics or just the geometry of squares and circles. And he claims the overall geometry is a better explanation because it would apply to way more ways of filling out the details. So if one atom on the peg was a bit different, the quantum explanation would be different, but the geometric explanation is the same. Or if you had a peg and board made of plastic or metal, right? The quantum explanation would have to be, you'd have to have a whole new set of descriptions of the atoms, so you have to at least ask the question, does the explanation still apply? So the quantum level explanations seems just to be way too detailed for the kind of explanation that we're looking for. The better explanation, says Putnam, is at the level of the overall shape of these things and just the mere fact that they don't pass through each other. So if you have the shape and the fact that they don't pass through each other, then you have your explanation. Okay? So that means that the best explanation of why the square peg doesn't go through the round hole is not at the level of its atoms necessarily. It's at the level of its structure as a whole, its overall structure. Okay? So that's supposed to be a general explanation or a general argument against the idea that the best explanation is always at the level of the parts. It's not to say that the best explanation is never at the level of its parts. So if you want to know how like a transistor works, probably you're going to have to get into, like if you want to know how this particular transistor works, you might have to get into its atomic structure. Or if you want to know how fusion in the sun works, you're probably going to have to talk about nuclear physics. Right? So it's not the case that Putnam's trying to convince you that micro explanations are garbage and you should never think about them. If you're doing neuroscience, you should look at neurons. The question is, if you're trying to figure out how people should live, are neurons the right level of description to consider? So to make just one distinction before we move on, I'd like to distinguish between what's called ontological reductionism and epistemic reductionism. So ontological means the theory of what is in the world, what stuff there is exists. So an ontological reductionist says the whole is just the sum of its parts in terms of, like, if you took away all of the atoms of this peg and board, there's no peg and board left. There's no spirit of the peg and board that remain, right? So the peg and board are completely composed of the material parts that make them up. That's ontological reductionism. Contrast that with what's called epistemic reductionism. Recall, epistemology is about the theory of justification of knowledge. So you can be an ontological reductionist and say, look, we're all just made of atoms, fine. But the whole is best explained in terms of the parts is not always true. So an epistemic reductionist says the whole is best explained in terms of its parts. So the best in principle explanation of any physical phenomena will always be at the level of, say, quantum mechanics. And this second thing is what Putnam wants you to resist. He wants to say, look, don't believe that the best explanation is always at the micro level, right? So if you want to understand the system, don't always go to the lowest possible level. Sometimes the higher levels of explanation are better for figuring out why it is the way it is. And science should track the best explanations, not necessarily the lowest ontological level. Okay? So this is not an argument. Putnam is not giving you an argument that there are souls. He's not giving you an argument that there is a mind that's independent of your body. He thinks that you're just a sack of chemicals suspended in water, in terms of what your parts are, but that furthermore, you're not explained best as a sack of chemicals suspended in water. Right? So to explain, so if you say love is just a chemical reaction, you're kind of, you could mean either of these two things. You're ambiguous between these two things. You say love is just a chemical reaction, you could be saying, look, all of my parts that are involved in loving my wife are chemical. So all of the things that constitute my love are chemicals. But that's not exactly the same as saying my experience as a conscious being is best explained in terms of those chemicals. Just like the best explanation of how to win a chess game is not at the level of wood grains. It's at the level of the overall structure. Okay, and that leads us into, so this is just the conclusion, so perhaps neuroscience is not the one and only science we should consult. It might be part of the story. It probably is part of the story about how to be a happy person. So if you're clinically depressed, there's a good chance that you just gotta, it's not the overall structure of your life that's gone wrong. There's a really good chance that you've got some neurotransmitters that aren't being distributed properly in your brain, and that's both the right level of understanding and the right level of intervening. So that's a totally possible thing, and so it's not that neuroscience is irrelevant, but it's not the one and only science that we should be consulting if we want to know how to live. Perhaps we need to know about the whole life of organisms, including their parts, but also including their whole being. So I promised you a kind of more mainstream philosophical take on this. This is, very briefly, we'll do Philippa Foot's picture of, which she calls, this is from a book called Natural Goodness. So Foot argues that thinking about normativity in general, so the way to ground normative claims in general, is with respect to whole organisms. So talking about a good person or a good life is logically the same, or it's grammatically the same, as talking about what's good for a tree. So if you know how a tree lives, if you know what its life cycle is like, how it reproduces and how it flourishes in the sense of continuing to be a tree, then you can say, well, this rain is going to be good for the tree. Now that's not a like robust moral claim in the way that we think of moral claims. It's not what is a good life on the human level, but Foot claims that it's logically the same structure. So if you want to talk about what's good, you have to talk about who it's good for. So good and bad on her account are always defined relative to some kind of agent. And she includes as agents trees, bacteria, animals, and humans. So virtue, she presents a kind of virtue ethics. Virtue is defined in terms of the sort of being that the agent as a whole is, which I propose is a different way of grounding normativity. So it's the same basic idea as Harris. You ground normativity in facts about the being, but whereas Harris has this kind of reductive approach, he said, look, we should look at brains, we should look at neurotransmitters. That's the right scientific approach to understanding how we are structured. Foot has a more holistic version. So Foot says, good and bad are defined relative to whole organisms, and whole organisms as they move through their life cycle. Right? So given a form of life is like a way of getting around in the world. Your ecological niche combined with your sort of the way your body's structured, the whole story about your survival in the world, you can give harm and benefit objective meanings. Right? So you can talk about the harm to an oak tree by a given parasite, and it's not that the oak tree needs to know anything about that. Right? This is not a perception by the oak tree. Probably oak trees don't perceive in any way that we would recognize. There's some debate about, I think there's some debate about plant cognition these days. Like, so plants actually have things that they can do, like they can pump nutrients up or down depending on like so if one plant gets attacked by a bug, it'll send out a pheromone that is detected by other plants that tell it to take the nutrients and pump them down into the roots so they're not accessible to the invader. Still, probably not what you or I mean by harm and benefit. And it's certainly not something that the plant has a conscious, fully developed perception of course. But nonetheless, we can talk about harms and benefits. Right? We can talk about what's good or bad for the plant. It's not a harm to the tree that it can't read poetry. Right? This is not a thing that the tree is lacking in its life. It is a harm to the tree if its leaves can't photosynthesize. Right? Because of the way that the tree makes its living, poetry would not help it. It would not enhance the tree's life. If you go read a poem to an oak tree, nothing good will happen to the tree. It might make you feel better, but it's not a benefit. Whereas if you cut off all of its branches so it can't photosynthesize, that's a harm to the tree. Right? And we know that not based on neuroscience. We know that based on all of the facts that we know about how trees get by in the world. And further, Foote claims, this is, again, I'd like to flag this as a controversial claim. This is probably not even the majority view in philosophy, but it is a substantial minority, that these facts, these agent-relative and life-relative facts, are objective normative facts. Mind-independent, in the sense of mind-independent normative facts. And then the suggestion is, maybe we can say something similar about humans. She does make a distinction between the story that you can tell about an oak tree and the story that you can tell about a human, of course. Because for an oak tree, harm and benefit is pretty easy to define, right? Oak trees have fairly straightforward goals. Make more oak trees. Don't die this winter. That's it as far as I can tell. But humans, of course, have a variety of goals. We can define for ourselves a huge variety of things that seem to us good or bad, but for Foote, the point is just that we can get a start on the normative question, right? So that shifts the normative question from like a total question mark to what kind of beings are we? And this is the move that's supposed to relate science and values, to relate the scientific questions to value questions. Because science can give us at least some grip on this question, what are we? And then if you have an answer to that, then you can tell whether something is helping you fulfill that thing that you are or harming you by moving you away from that thing that you are. So this brings us back to the basic questions that Gauguin raised. Where do we come from? What are we? Where are we going? And how should we live? And the suggestion that I want to sort of justify with Foote is that the first two questions, where do we come from, what are we, are reasonably answered by evolutionary biology, or at least that's a promising place to look for answers to at least those first two questions, which give us some help, some constraints on the question, where are we going and how should we live? That's the hope anyway. So what we're going to do for the next little while is explore evolutionary biology as a kind of source of answers about what sort of beings are we? What is human nature? Human nature has not got a really great reputation in humanities. A lot of people will tell you that there is no such thing. There's simply no such thing as human nature. And we'll see on Wednesday that belief in a human nature and that evolutionary biology can tell us what it is has had some quite disastrous results. Like, this is not a project that's always gone well, and I'm severely understating that problem. Like, the belief in that science can tell us what kind of beings we are and that that can inform how we should act in the world has underwritten some incredibly heinous actions. Like, really, really disturbingly bad stuff has been done in the name of that belief. So by no means am I saying that this is a simple argument or that it's easy or that you should you should just go to an evolutionary bio textbook and read off of it what kind of being you are, and then it'll just be obvious how to live your life. That is definitely not the point, and we're going to talk extensively about how horribly wrong that line of reasoning can go. Really, really badly wrong. Nonetheless, for somebody like me who doesn't have the religious framework to answer these questions, it looks to me like the best hope that science is going to be able to inform us at least about the first two, and that gives you a basis for moving forward with the second two. That's the hope. So evolution is going to be the place. Here's Darwin as a chimp, I guess. Evolution is going to be the place rather than neuroscience, because evolution is where what the science that deals with organisms as whole beings, right? Evolution is where you talk about the life cycle of an organism, how it fits into its world, how it's adapted or ill-adapted, and that kind of thing. It's a genuinely dangerous question to think about, I would suggest, because in history, it has gone so badly wrong. But with that said, I think we'll be prepared. So next class, we're going to read Darwinism, Social Darwinism, and Eugenics to find all about how the study can go terribly, terribly wrong. And we'll talk about evolution and human nature.